You don't have to be a physics teacher to appreciate a good pendulum, but it helps. You tie a mass to a string from the top of your ceiling, you pull it back and you let it go. Gravitational potential energy to kinetic energy and back again. Maybe there's some trigonometry in there. Teachers talk about the swing of a pendulum in our educational world as well. Curriculum, pedagogy, assessment, even technology. We've all experienced the back and forth swing over the course of any teacher's career and time in the classroom. The mid-2000s saw the ardent adaptation of digital whiteboards across Alberta. Whether they were made by Smart Technologies or Promethean, we saw school divisions and schools and teachers flock to this new technology. So, is there any place left over for the old, crappy analog whiteboard? But those digital whiteboards never delivered on the promise of what they said they were going to be. Too often it was the teacher standing at the front, trying to press buttons and make something exciting happen, but the students never got to interact with it and use it in a really educational way. Not to mention that as time went on, the board started to fail. Software stopped getting updated. And eventually, teachers just moved away from the technology altogether. Our digital whiteboards died. Now what we're left with are these old school analog whiteboards. What could we ever use those for? Today, my colleague Ruben and I are going to show you lots of different things you can do in high school sciences with 3D printed manipulatives. We're going to see how you can use the magnetic ability of the whiteboard to make student-friendly and student-centered manipulatives that get the most bang for your buck. We're also going to show you some real-life teaching examples from our classes and the way we use them with our students. And we'll even show you how to get started with a 3D printer if you're intimidated and you've never used it before. Hi, I'm Brad Langdale.
And I'm Ruben Mahaffey.
We're teachers with Parkland School Division here in Spruce Grove. And today we're going to talk to you a little bit about how you can use a 3D printer in order to create manipulatives you can use in your science classroom.
We'll start by looking at some of the ways that we use 3D printed manipulatives in our physics, chemistry, biology, and general science classes, how we got to the point of having fairly polished 3D printed things, because that's not how we started. We'll go through kind of our prototyping process. How do we decide what we want? And then how do we actually go through the process of making these things, first in a really cheap way that anybody can do, and then in a more polished way.
At the end of the video, we'll also have a tutorial that you can watch and follow along with, so you can be 3D printing your own magnetic manipulatives in no time. We'll also talk to you a little bit about how you can get funding for this, because we all know that it's tough to find money in schools. There are ways that you can go around this and get some cash so that you can buy your own 3D printer if you don't have one at your school already.
Perfect. I'm excited about the cash part.
Yeah, me too. All right, let me show you a Physics 20 example of how you can use some of these 3D printed manipulatives. These are vector arrows that have embedded rare earth neodymium magnets in them. So you probably know what I'm going to talk about based on the picture. It's the dreaded inclined plane problem from the forces unit in Physics 20. It's probably one of the trickier parts in the whole course, as students have to figure out a free body diagram that makes sense to relate all the vectors together in this situation. Here we've got a mass on a ramp, and we'll do one without friction to start off with at some sort of angle. So of course we're going to have our students start off by thinking about a free body diagram of the forces here. And normally we would just draw them out with a whiteboard pen or something like that. But here we're going to use these 3D printed vector arrows. So I've got one that I can label with our force of gravity. I've got a second one that's the normal force. And students always have trouble with this. It's nice to be able to put it in one spot and ask them, oh, does that make sense? Should it look like that? Or be able to quickly manipulate it and ask them if it should look like that instead. Okay, so now we've got our normal force in place. We're going to put in our parallel force of gravity. And we've got a pretty good looking free body diagram. And I find a lot of students are pretty successful up to that point. But where they really start to struggle is how can we take those vectors and make it into a triangle so that we can actually do some trigonometry with it. One of the great things about this is that tactile ability to grab something physical and move it around. So here with our 3D printed manipulatives, I can actually physically take this arrow and just slide it down here. And I can take my parallel force of gravity and slide it into place. We've designed the arrows as Pythagorean triplets so they work out to a nice right angle triangle. And the students immediately get feedback about the relationship between the free body diagram and the vector diagram. For years, I've wanted to be able to grab vectors and move them around on my whiteboard. And I've tried doing it with digital software before, but it was always a little bit clunky. In fact, the students used to get a lot of laughs out of me messing around with the whiteboard, trying to figure out how to make it work. These are quick and easy. They live on the side of my board, and I can grab them anytime that I want to quickly show what's going on with vectors in a forces situation. So how are you going to pay for a 3D printer? Because most of these are going to run around $1,000, and that's probably more than your classroom budget is. Well, you've got a couple of different options. One thing you can do is take a look at your school administration and talk to them about sources of funding you might have at the school level. Maybe there's a technology budget with a little bit of money left over at the end of the year. A 3D printer is a great complement to things like Chromebooks or other classroom devices. Maybe you're in a bigger high school like we are and you have a department with a department budget. And at the end of the year, there might be a little bit of extra money left over to spend on something like a 3D printer. Or maybe you need to go and look at the school division level. In our school division, we've got someone who helps us to find grants. And there's lots of great grant programs out there, like A+ for Energy and the APEGA grant, which specifically give grant money for science-related endeavors. The important thing is to be optimistic and not just right off the bat discount the idea because you don't have the money. We find that a lot of times the money is out there. It just takes a little bit of work sometimes to find it.
The idea for this whole thing was born out of frustration about teaching genetics. And in Biology 30, when we're teaching mitosis or meiosis, we have to show how the chromosomes move through the different phases. It can get to be a bit of a pain, right? Because you're drawing your cells on the board and drawing these little stick chromosomes moving through the different stages of mitosis and meiosis. And there are two problems with it. One of them is that it's hard to keep track of what's happening in between the different stages. So you have this snapshot of prophase, and then we have a snapshot of metaphase. And students often don't understand what's happening between prophase and metaphase. How do the chromosomes get from here to here? Because we just show them these snapshots. The second issue is it ends up taking a lot of time to collectively draw all of these different diagrams. And so that frustration led me to first draw chromosomes on little pieces of paper, little sticky notes like this, right? And put them up onto the board. And it's a way to get around the problem of having to redraw every time, or it's to kind of give an additional way to show what we're doing. And then I can show my chromosomes in prophase, right? They can come together in metaphase. They can get pulled apart in anaphase. And then in telophase, they can be redrawn in their own new nuclear envelope, if that is happening in this case. And I like that. And I realized that I could put little markers for the genes on here. And that would be a way to kind of keep track of what was going on. So I built some of these little paper chromosomes. And then I thought, well, we have this 3D printer. Can't we use that instead? And so I 3D printed some little chromosomes and embedded magnets into the back of them, and realized that I could stick them onto the whiteboard. And I can still add chromosome labels, right, which I just did with little pieces of tape, which can then allow me to show crossing over, for example, between one chromosome and another. And these were kind of the first version, so they're a little bit beat up, and I don't have them all anymore. But I really liked the idea, and the next thought then was to put these magnets on the back, print out little gene markers, and I could have a big A, or I could have a little a that I could just swap and stick right onto the chromosome. And I could have a second gene down here, a B or a C or a D or whatever I wanted. And so I kind of like this idea, but there were a couple of problems with it. One of them was that the magnets in these little indents here, I tried to glue them in, and the glue didn't stick particularly well. And so the magnets would fall out, and they would stick to the whiteboard, or they would start to protrude, and they'd scratch the whiteboard, and that was no good. So the second iteration, the second version, I tried flattening them out a bit to try to make them print a little bit faster and give a nice spot for the allele markers to sit. And I made a couple of versions of those that function kind of in the same way. So there are magnets that the markers can stick to like this. But I wasn't really that happy with how they were looking, and eventually came up with this version here, where you can have a chromosome, a replicated chromosome like that. We can have a chromosome 1 and a chromosome 2, and then we can have different markers like this. So we could have a big A, little a. We could have C's down here, C's over here. And then you can show things like crossing over with these two ends swapping. And we can now walk these guys through the stages of mitosis and meiosis with a chromosome 1 and a chromosome 2, a pair of chromosome 2s. And so this worked fairly well. I printed a set, and I let Sarah, my colleague who teaches biology as well, try them out. She seemed to think that they were okay too, so maybe we're onto something. And it sort of follows the same sort of philosophy that I use when I'm buying tools, which is first thing that you do is you buy the really crappy one. If it's something that you use all the time, you're going to wear it out, and then you can bring it to your partner and say, hey, I wore out this really crappy tool. Now I need to buy the expensive one. Then you buy the expensive one because you've demonstrated to yourself and to the person who controls the purse strings that this is something that you're actually going to do. When you're at school, the person who's controlling the purse strings is your department head or your administrator, and so you have to prove to them that this is something that you actually need to use on a day-to-day basis. So starting with something like pieces of sticky tape can help you to show to yourself and to other people, say, hey, this is something that is actually going to work and is going to be useful in my teaching, because it might not be. And then by the time we get to the 3D printed version, now we've built something that's going to last year after year. It's reusable. We can add to it. We can print more letters. If things get lost, we can find, if things get lost, we can print new ones. And we have a whole system now that can be used. We can use this as a teacher-directed activity at the front, where I'm using it to demonstrate, or I can print smaller ones, or I can give this set to a student and have them go through the process as well. And so there are some advantages and disadvantages to the 3D printed set. Obvious advantage is it's relatively cheap. This whole set can be produced for a few pennies of 3D printing filament. The magnets are relatively inexpensive. The main thing that you have to do is figure out how to actually model these, and then you have to kind of babysit the printer while it's printing them. But it's relatively easy to do and figure out. So there's a low barrier to entry. As long as you have a 3D printer, which you can get your hands on for certainly less than $1,000, less than $500 if you want to, we can print something like this. The modeling has got a relatively low barrier to entry as well. I'll show you at the end of the talk how to use Tinkercad to create shapes like this relatively quickly. We'll create a shape in about 20 minutes that we could then send to the printer. We're producing something that's really niche. So at least as far as I know, Boreal or like our other science suppliers, they don't carry a set like this, probably because not enough people would want one. But it's easy to create something quickly and easily on the 3D printer that can do that. And I can then share that file with anybody. So you can send me an email and I can send you the file, which you can then use to print your own set that you can use yourself. And we can continually improve. This is the 4th version of the chromosome set, and there are still some things that could be better about it, right? We could have the tails of these chromosomes actually be able to swap so that not just the letter can change, but the actual color could change as well. But that would require adding another layer of complexity right? So that these can separate and maybe snap onto each other somehow. Which is also sort of a disadvantage, that we've built something, it's our creative baby, and it's never really finished. So there's always something that we can do to improve and to make this better, which can be good. It can also be bad if you're a bit of a perfectionist, like I tend to be. Another way that I use these in my class is I built a little set to help me explain how dissociation happens. So I have some that are 3D printed little ions. So I have some cations, and I have some anions. And I can build a little section of a crystal lattice with them. And then I have some water molecules. And the water molecules are flat as well. And they have magnets placed in them so that we can talk about the polar nature of the water molecule. And we can put on some little partial charges. So we can recognize that this partial positive should come here. It shouldn't come in the middle of the molecule. It shouldn't come on the oxygen side of the molecule. It should come down here. And a person could also print little hydrogen-oxygen labels if they wanted to add them onto that as well. So we recognize that this water molecule is polar. If we want to label the additional water molecules, we can. But students probably get the idea at this point that the partially negative side of the one water molecule can experience the hydrogen bonding to the hydrogen side of the other one. And so we can talk about how water molecules can experience those intermolecular forces. Then we can also talk about how the water molecules can cause the ionic crystal to dissociate and dissolve. So as my labeled water molecule comes up here, it's not going to want to approach like this because these two negatives will repel. So it'll flip around and then experience some ion dipole attraction here. And these water molecules can then surround the anion, pull it into the solution like this. And then we have this hydrated ion in this little pocket. And then as the water molecules approach the positive ions, the cations, the opposite will happen, right? The water molecules will approach this way, pull the ions into the solution, and now we have these aqueous ions that are free-flowing in solution. We can talk about, well, if we have a saturated solution, we don't have enough water molecules to be able to pull these additional ions off of the crystal, and we can explain nicely the process of dissociation. As we know, it's sometimes tricky for students to picture molecules in 3D via CPR shapes, and the model kits help a lot with that. But one thing that the model kits can't do a good job of is showing students what the dipole vectors look like when we're considering if a molecule is polar or not. So there are digital tools that we can use. PhET has a good one, but this is another situation where doing it hands-on can sometimes be better. So a few years ago, I had the idea of taking the model kits and using pipe cleaners to build little vector arrows that students could attach to the bonds. And it actually worked quite well. And so students could build a chloromethane like this, put the dipole vector on to this bond here, can build another little dipole arrow, and they would repeat for all of these polar bonds, showing which way the electrons are being pulled by the more electronegative element. And then they could use a different color pipe cleaner to show the overall molecular dipole. And that worked pretty well. It does take a bit of time for students to build the dipole vectors, and they sometimes get a little bit tricky to maneuver or to hold them to make sure that they're all sitting in the right direction. So 3D printing to the rescue again, and we've printed a bunch of these little clip-on plastic dipole vector arrows that are really easy to use. So all the student needs to do is pull them out of the bag, and they can pop on the right number of dipole vector arrows like this. Let's make sure that they're pointing in the right direction. We can look at that in 3D, figure out how the vectors are going to cancel or partially cancel, and then use that to help decide whether the molecule is polar and what direction the overall molecular dipole would be in. So these are very easy to print. You don't need to do any futzing around with magnets or things like that, and they end up being really, really inexpensive.
One of the things I've been trying to get my students to do the last couple of years is make free body diagrams, turn them into vector diagrams, and then solve those vector diagrams geometrically instead of using trig. Sometimes it's hard to get them to do that though, because they don't see the relationship between the vector diagram and the triangle it makes. And so using the 3D printed vectors really helps with that. I love these magnets with hooks on them. I can put a spring scale right on it, and I can set up a static equilibrium problem really quickly. Students can come up and measure the angles and then make a free body diagram. So we've got a force of gravity that we can put in, and then we have two equal forces of tension. And the students can line those up at the exact angles of the spring scales. It now makes it a lot easier for the students to go and see the relationship between this free body diagram and the vector triangle that's formed. As long as the students don't tilt or change the angle of the vectors, they can go and do a little bit of trial and error to play around with it until they start to see what the relationship is. Now it's a lot easier for students to understand that if they know what the length of one of these arrows are, and they know what the angles are, they can draw a scale diagram and work out the other two sides of the vector. It was always difficult to get students to recognize the relationship between that original free body diagram and this now nicely scaled triangle. And so being able to have these vector arrows ready whenever a student needed a hand is a real help in the classroom.
Okay, so this is the tutorial section of the talk. So you're still here if you want to see how can I actually model and print something in 3D. And I'm going to show you how to first model something from scratch and then to print it in about 10 or 15 minutes. So it'll go relatively quickly. The thing that we want to accomplish first of all is I'm not going to do anything fancy with magnets. Let's just make something that we can use as a manipulative. So this is something to help students with balancing equations. Back when I had a smartboard, I had this smart notebook activity that I got from somewhere where somebody had created these equations and had kind of a little balancing program. So you see it here. I don't have smart notebook anymore, but I found this viewer that lets me open the file. And I have an equation up here. So phosphorus and oxygen making this phosphorus pentoxide. And what students would do is coming in fresh, they could drag up these representations of the molecules, and then instead of having to consider phosphoruses, they can count the pips here and really logically get a sense of, oh, I need to have the same amount of phosphorus on this side and the same amount on the other side. Now there's a couple of downsides with it. One of them is that only one person can use it at a time. I only had one smartboard. I'd really like this to be something that I could make maybe 4 or 5 reactions and have little sets of them, and I could set them up as stations. And students could balance them one at a time. Or I could make a bigger version and have it stick to the whiteboard. We'll see if we tackle that a little bit later on. But to start out, we just want to make something that students can use. So let's do this reaction first of all. So we want phosphorus and oxygen making this phosphorus pentoxide. Now, to consider how many of these I'm going to need, let's just balance it. So there would be 2 and then 5. Okay. What I need to have then is some little pips kind of that students can use. So an oxygen might look like that. Phosphorus, maybe I'll just cram them together. Little P's on the phosphorus, little O's on the oxygen. And then the phosphorus pentoxide maybe will look like this. Something like that. I'm not going to worry about VSCPR shapes or really about molecular shape at all because that's not the point here. The point is just to get students balancing. So now I need to create a few of these. I don't want to telegraph with my kit exactly how many they're going to need. So I might make 8 oxygens. Maybe I'll make 4 of these, and maybe I'll make 3 of these. And so that's how many I'm actually going to produce and to put in the little kit so that students can have some extras. Now, okay, what about the size of these things? So I've drawn them out kind of roughly how big I want them to be, and looks like that's about 1 centimeter. So my little pips then, I'm going to design them to be about 1 centimeter in diameter. In terms of their height, I'm thinking maybe about 0.5 centimeter, or maybe a little bit less, maybe about 0.4 centimeters in terms of the height of the little pips. And I think that's going to be a pretty nice size for a little set for students to use in groups at their desk. So to create this now, I'm going to go to the program Tinkercad. Tinkercad is nice because it's totally free. You don't need to buy anything. So I've signed in with my account. I want to create a new design. Okay, so it gives it a kind of random, silly name. Let's call this Balancing Equations Pentoxide. Since I'm planning on making 4 or 5 of these equations. There we go. Okay, so my basic pip then, you see it gives me a bunch of shapes that I can use. These ones are solid. These ones are voids if I want to add any voids to my shapes. And the basic principle here is we build up our shapes by kind of adding basic shapes together. We've got text that we can use, and we can put these things together to make whatever kind of built-up shape that we want to make. So my basic shape that I want to deal with is a cylinder. So I'm going to drag on a cylinder, kind of align it with the grid, and then it's going to show me some dimensions. I want these to be 1 centimeter. Now this is reading in millimeters. So 10 millimeters by 10 millimeters. The height, we thought about 4 millimeters. And let's see what that looks like. Make it a nice smooth circle. And yeah, that's looking pretty, kind of like the balance of that overall shape. Okay, so there's my basic pip shape. Now I think I'm going to add an element symbol to the top. So I can do that. Nope, not another cylinder. Let's get that out of here. I can do that with this text function. Now let's make a phosphorus first. So I want the text here to be a P. We're going to scale it. If I hold the shift key, it will scale it uniformly. And we want it to fit kind of nice and centered on my molecule. Maybe something like that. Now we want to make it a little bit taller, and I want it to stick up above, so I'm going to make this 4.3 millimeters. And now it's not quite centered, and it's not letting me quite center it because it's snapping to a 1 millimeter grid. So let's just snap it to a very fine grid while we get it nice and centered. There. I like the looks of that. So there's my phosphorus. Now if I want to create an oxygen, I can just select all of this, copy, and paste. Now I've got another one of these. Let's line it up with this grid here. Scooch over, and we want to select just the phosphorus label because now we want it to be an O for oxygen. Other than that, we don't want it to be any different. We want it to be right in the middle still, which I'm not really concerned with it being the exact middle. That looks good enough to me. Now I've got my phosphorus and my oxygen. So these are kind of my masters. I'm going to just drag these kind of out of the way. Actually, before we do that, let's set our grid back. So let's set these together kind of out of the way up here. Now, one of the ways that I can have these two things stand out from each other is to make them different colors. For the individual phosphorus in the P4 and the oxygens in the O2, that's easy. I can just print them separately from each other, and I can change the color of filament that the printer is using in between. But for the phosphorus pentoxide, it's going to be a little bit trickier because it has to all print as one unit. And I don't want to assemble it. That sounds like a pain. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my oxygen and I'm going to make it a little bit shorter. So instead of 4 millimeters, I'm going to make this one 3.7. Let's make the letter a little bit shorter, 4. And let's make the phosphorus just a little bit taller, 4.3. 0.6. And then I'll show you how this is going to work. When I put them together to make the pentoxide, they'll be at 2 different levels, and I can tell the printer to pause, and I can change colors, and that's the way I can get 2 different colors out of this thing. Okay, so here's my masters. What I can do is I can group them together. Group. Group. And then I can start to build my molecules. So I'll leave my main P over there. I need 4 in phosphorus. So I'll just have them overlap by a little bit. Something like that looks fine. So there's my P4. Now my oxygen is going to be an O2. I'm not worrying about my quantities yet because I'm going to worry about that later on when I'm in my slicing program that's going to prepare it for the 3D printer. Now to make my pentoxide, we know we need an oxygen in the middle. Phosphorus on either side. And then we need some more oxygens. Again, I'm not so concerned with molecular shape. I want to make it kind of reasonable-ish, but it's not what students are going to be thinking about, and that's not what we're going to be thinking about when we use this either. So it's more concerned with it being easy to see what everything is. Okay, let's see if we can get this lined up. Okay, there we go. Now I'm also thinking I might want some equation symbols, like we're going to want a reaction arrow and a little plus. So let's see if we have any other shapes. Basic shapes. What about design starters? What are some numbers? More shapes. See if we can find an arrow. We could build up an arrow using a rectangle and a triangle, but this is going to be easier. So we want to make it kind of as small as we think we can get away with, because the arrow isn't really the point. That looks kind of decent. And let's make it about 4 millimeters tall, maybe. Go, and I guess we want a little addition symbol too, which I could probably do as a plus. Oops, that's just a letter A. We want the text generator. There's a little plus. We can make it maybe about that. Maybe we'll make it a little bigger. That looks fine. Very tall, so let's make it 4 millimeters high. Okay, and then let's try printing something. So this oxygen should be quite easy. If we want to print it now, we're going to just select the shape that we want to print. We can hit export. We need to save it as an STL file because that's what my printer is going to accept, or my slicing software is going to accept that. Okay, so let's call this balancing equations pentoxide. Okay, so now I can go into my slicing software. So this is what takes the 3D file and separates it out into a series of layers, and then the 3D printer is going to add plastic layer by layer as it builds. This is free software as well. Ultimaker makes 3D printers They also make this software that works with basically any 3D printer that we want to use. So I have mine set up already for my printer. We're going to have a nice big layer height so that this prints nice and fast, and we're not really concerned about it being particularly amazing quality. That's not what we're looking for here. Let's find our file. Here's my oxygen. Drag it in, and we've got this cute little oxygen now sitting here right in the middle of the build plate. It's telling me this is going to take 4 minutes to print. I've used a very small amount of my filament, which is great, and so it's going to cost me about 1 cent worth of plastic. The printer, of course, costs money, but the plastic is very, very inexpensive. So it means that making a prototype is not something that I'm concerned with at all. So I can save this file now, this sliced file, and I can bring it over to my 3D printer. Now I've saved my file on this micro USB card, which is what the 3D printer accepts. So let's load this guy in here. Let's turn on the printer, and let's let it do its thing. So we want to first preheat it. It's going to start warming up. I have some red 3D printing filament loaded because we're printing some oxygens, so of course we want them to be red. And then let's find my file. Oxygen test 1. Now the printer is wanting it to be 200 degrees and 60 degrees Celsius temperature of the bed. So it's going to heat itself up to those settings, and then it's going to start to do its thing. And then the extruder is right at the bottom there. So it's going to heat up and extrude little bits of plastic, and that's what's going to do the 3D printing. Now it's laying down the first layers. Let's see how it works. Okay, so let's see how we did. These are adorable. They are not huge. They are a little on the small side, but I think that that's okay. They're going to work well as pips here that they can move around. They're not going to take up a lot of space, and we want them just to be little tokens that they can count. If we had been interested in having the element symbols stand out more, we could have changed colors at the very end, maybe changed to black for the last few layers, and then it would have printed them in black, which would have made them stand out more. I don't actually mind that these are red because and that the element symbol doesn't stand out particularly well, because we really want students just to scan, and the color is really helpful for that. So we've printed a thing. Now I'll print some of the other ones. Now let me show you how I'm going to prepare the pentoxide to print so that it will end up with 2 different colors. So I'll select my molecule that I want to export again. Export this as an STL, and let's call this pentoxide. Bring it into my slicing program. Now I can leave the settings the same, but the thing that I need to do is I need to add a pause. So in extensions post-processing, there's a little spot that I can add custom scripts to run. So the one that I want to run is called a pause at height. So I'm going to tell the printer, when you get to a particular layer number, you are going to pause. Now pausing at height can be a little bit finicky. I figured out with my printer I need to use a BQ-M25 method, and I need to add a code here that causes it to beep. For whatever reason, the printer doesn't work if it doesn't beep. We want it, while it's paused, to stay at temperature. We want it to wait for 1800 seconds, which is the longest we can tell it to wait before it does anything. We can tell it, go to the side of the print area, and then we need to figure out what layer number we need to pause at. So we can leave this up here. Let's take a look at what my file looks like in the preview mode. So this is now showing each of the layers that the printer will build up, starting at the bottom and working up to the top. And so what I want to do is figure out where does it finish the oxygens and start the phosphorus. So it does the oxygens here, layer 13, and then it does 2 more layers for the phosphorus. So I want to print my oxygen color all the way up to here, and then I'll change colors for that last layer for the phosphorus. So layer 13, we want it to finish layer 13, and then it's going to pause 13. Perfect. Okay, we'll save this, and let's give it a try.
We're at the pause here, and it's done the oxygens, but it's just starting on the phosphoruses. So I'm going to take this black filament and swap out the red filament that's on the machine, and then I will tell it to keep printing. We're all done. Here is our molecule. So the phosphoruses, the oxygens, the height difference isn't really noticeable unless you're looking for it. And I think it turned out really nicely. So I'll print up the rest of the set, and then I'll take a shot so that you can see it all put together.
I'm happy with how these turned out. It ended up being about 15 or 20 minutes worth of modeling time, one trial of prototyping, and then printing this whole batch, which took about 2.5 hours. But I didn't really have to do anything other than making sure that I was around so that I could change the color when it came time to do that. I think this will work really nicely. I'm going to try it out in my classroom. I'll set up a placemat with an equation above, and then different boxes where they'll put the reagents, and then kind of pull them in, put them into the equation area when they're counting them. And I'm going to give this a try the next time that I teach Science 10 and introduce chemical balancing. For the STL files for 3D printing, as well as a tutorial on how to embed magnets, which isn't really any more complicated than changing the color of a print partway through. For those kinds of instructions, I'll direct you to my website, which is mahaffey.ca, and you'll find on the talks subpage a page about this talk and some of that information. If there's anything that you're interested in, or you have any questions, or you can't find something, do email me, and I'm really happy to respond to you. Well, and if you're still here at the bitter end, it means that you either are very interested in this, or maybe you have me going in the background while you're making lunch. But in either case, thanks for sticking with us till the end.
Thanks so much for tuning into our talk today. We were really happy to have a chance to virtually work with you at your teachers' convention. You can also email us if you have any questions. My email is bradley.langdale@psd.ca.
And mine is ruben.mahaffey@psd.ca, and we'll have those as text somewhere here, Brad. Brad's going to edit in.
We can make that happen.
Yeah. We do have a few extra sets, a couple of extra sets. So if you want to just kind of connect with us, if you're interested in this, send us an email, and we might be able to even send you a set that you can play around with and let us know what you think of it.
Thanks. Enjoy the rest of your convention.
Audio 1.
Well, we've got some different ideas for you here today, and we're going to take a look at, I don't know, we're going to take a look at, now I'm just riffing here.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. What do you can do with your hands?
I don't know.
I always do this, and I'm noticing, I got to stop that, because I'm getting tired of editing those out.